From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there and welcome to Chicago Newsroom here on Can TV. I'm Ken Davis on a week where we are dealing with all kinds of chaos in Chicago, fiscal chaos to say the least, at CPS and with CTU. And do we have a deal? Don't we have a deal? We have lots and lots of unstable news to mull over this week. So we decided here on Chicago Newsroom that we would sidestep that for a week or so. I think we're going to have Karen Lewis possibly next week or the week after. We'll be talking about that. But today we need to talk about some good news because, yes, Mayor Emanuel has had his problems. He's had his travails in the last few weeks. But his good news is that lots and lots of children have been saved and have been made more safe by his red light camera program. And here to talk with us about that is the guy who knows probably more about the red light program than the mayor does, David Kidwell from the Tribune, joining us once again. Good to have you back, David.
Great to be back.
So there has been a lot of news in the red light world in the last few weeks. I should say you started dogging this thing about 4 years ago. And we want to go back for a nice deep dive and see what's happened in the last 4 years. But the update, the big news, is that the guy who essentially ran the program for the city of Chicago, who nobody had ever even heard of, some bureaucrat in the Department of Transportation named John Bills, just got his justice.
Yeah, well, it's important to know that Mayor Daley and and Mike Madigan knew who he was.
Yes, apparently
from the very
so.
beginning.
Yeah.
He came up through a patronage army. He was a top earning precinct captain for Mike Madigan. But yes, he was the person from the very beginning who was most responsible for bringing red light cameras to Chicago and growing the program to the largest in the nation. And last week, he was convicted in federal court of his involvement in taking cash bribes for every new camera that went up throughout the city of Chicago, and there were nearly 400 of them at its peak. The program has earned more than $600 million, and he
earned is a weird word, but yeah.
In fines from the drivers of the city of Chicago, and he has been charged. He was convicted of taking up to $2 million in bribes from the camera vendor that floods traffic systems. I
have to say that I count myself among the many people who are just downright cynical about how things work in Chicago and bagmen, and we've all heard these stories for decades. But this was at a scale that actually made my eyes open and look and say, wait a minute, you can't do that.
Even by Chicago standards.
Even by Chicago standards. So can I read you back something that you wrote? I love reading things to people that they've written. One of the big questions, of course, was who made these decisions about where these cameras were supposed to go? And you wrote, for years, city officials have been unable to explain how camera locations were chosen when Bills was running the program. The trial portrayed a brazen scheme in which some of the most important camera placement meetings occurred over corned beef sandwiches at Manny's and often ended with a stack of $100 bills passed from bagman to Bills in a manila envelope. Well, at least they chose a classy restaurant to do it in.
Exactly, and it makes you wonder who they. You go there and you always see somebody important there. It makes you wonder who was across the room while they were sitting there passing the envelope.
I don't think I'll ever go to Manny's again without looking around and thinking, how much money is changing hands in this room right now? It just
exactly. Yeah. But there were dozens and dozens. The federal prosecutors laid out dozens and dozens of these meetings where he would get 6,000 here, 8,000 there, 12,000 in an envelope.
Now, one of the reps, and there are many on the red light program, is that so many of these cameras were put at intersections where there was no scientific or data-based reason for putting a camera at that location.
All of them were placed at intersections where there was no scientific data behind it because the city has never done any science at all.
Okay, picky.
They take crash statistics, and I've talked to a lot of experts about this, and the city has never done what traffic experts I've spoken with say needs to be done, because you can't, even if you have a high crash intersection, you don't know, just looking at statistics, what's causing those crashes. And what you're supposed to do is a very complex scientific study to try to peel away all the reasons that may be the cause of it. And then once you've determined a problem, and once you've determined that there isn't any other way to solve that problem, then you consider these sort of invasive, big brother kind of technology. That's never happened at the City of Chicago, ever. Still, to this day. The only science that's ever been done on this program was done by the Chicago Tribune more than a year ago.
But there was some distinction about there being some criterion of whether there have been 4 injury-related accidents at that intersection over a period of time, right?
That's a study that the Tribune did in 2014.
That's your study.
It's the only study that's ever been done. They've earned more than $600 million in revenue, and not one dime of that has ever been spent on any kind of a scientific assessment of the effect that these cameras are having out there on the street. So in the midst of that, in the midst of the fact that we were getting all of these false claims and false safety claims from the City Hall, from the mayor, from the transportation department, we decided, you know what, we need to spend some money and really figure out what's going on out there, and that's what we did. And what they found was, they did this very lengthy study, and we collected data for them, and they did a control group, and they did it the way you're supposed to do it. And they found that nearly half the cameras throughout the city never had a problem to begin with. I mean, half the intersections.
The intersection never had a problem.
And they said that there was no benefit. I mean, the city has always claimed that, well, these cameras they help to bring down T-bone right-angle crashes, the ones that are more dangerous or more threatening, cause more severe injuries. There's all kinds of science out there that says, yeah, they may do that, but they also increase rear-enders because people are cognizant and they stop short, so avoid a ticket. And that's always been the city's claim. So what this science found was, at those intersections that in the before period had fewer than 4 right-angle crashes involving injuries, there's never been a safety benefit. And at the same time, there's been this 22% increase in rear-end injury-related crashes. So there are cameras out there that are very, very likely to be making things more dangerous for us at up to 40% of the intersections where they're equipped. And when you lay that against the fact that the guy who was putting them in was taking a cash bribe for every camera that he put in, it makes you wonder why those cameras are, and we presented this science to them more than a year ago, and those cameras, most of them, are still up and running and still raking in millions of dollars in fines, and they're probably making things worse.
Now, to be fair to John Bills, though, maybe he did do a scientific study before he decided what intersections to put them in.
Any science he got would have come from Redflex traffic systems.
So, I'd like to sort of try to lay out a bit of a timeline of this thing, because it gets really confusing. You yourself have written dozens of stories on this, and it gets kind of weird to put them all into perspective. This thing started in 2002.
Yes.
Which even surprises me when you think back on it. I would have said it was much later than that, but 02.
Right. Well, when it started in 02, it was a two intersection pilot program. There was 2 competing
Peterson
companies.
and Western, I believe, right?
Yeah. But there were just 2 intersections, and there was one company and another company, and that's where the scheme began, because one company was trying one way to worm its way into City Hall, and Redflex was trying another way to worm its way into City Hall, and they apparently got John Bills. And he had more juice than the other guy, but they were secret.
Just hold on. Sorry to interrupt you. Was John Bills working for the city in 2002?
At the time he was an assistant commissioner.
Okay.
And he was.
He was in transportation.
Yes, he was the guy who was assigned to oversee this program. And there's an interesting story there. It sort of helps to explain why there are more unanswered questions than answered questions there. At the time that John Bills was handed this project, he had just come off of an experience where he learned the consequences of going off the political reservation. He was a for decades he'd been a precinct captain for Mike Madigan's vaunted 13th Ward political organization.
Ward, yeah.
Very, very powerful organization. And his job as a precinct captain would be to do what Mike Madigan told him to do, get the vote out in this precinct, go over here, help this alderman, go help that state representative, go help that Supreme Court justice. Do whatever you need to do according to Mike Madigan. Well, in about the year 2000, a friend of his, Pat LeVar, was running for county clerk against Dorothy Brown. And he, on his own, without seeking permission, apparently went to offer his services to Pat LeVar.
Who had been an alderman, right?
Yeah. And I don't know if he was an alderman then, but he was a friend of John Bills. And so when Mike Madigan heard about it, and we've written all this, but when Mike Madigan heard about that, John Bills was in trouble. What are you doing? Dorothy Brown is my person. Why are you off?
So to be clear, you do what Mike Madigan tells you to do. You do not do things that Mike Madigan does not tell you to do.
Well, this is what happened to John Bills in 2001. He was an assistant commissioner, a very high-level position. He ended up, after that incident, handed a tape measure and sent to a trailer where he was measuring offices for renovations for a year. So he learned very early what it was like to go off. I mean, this guy knows not to do what everybody is claiming he did. And it's interesting that this thing seems to stop with him.
It's fascinating. It really is.
Yeah.
All right, so it's let's talk about Rich Daly. Daly has this camera program from 2002, hands it over in 2011. By the time he leaves office, he's got a lot of cameras.
Yes, it was the largest. By the time he left office, it was the largest camera operation, red light camera operation in the country. It had 384 cameras, I believe, and it was raking in hundreds of millions of dollars. The big expansion happened in 06, 07, 08 in that area, and all this time, John Bills was working with this company behind the scenes, picking where these things went and working to expand their contract. So when Rahm Emanuel took office in 2011, he already inherited this wonderful program that was making all this money and saving all these lives. And his thing was he wanted to expand it to speed cameras. And at that time, Redflex was a shoo-in because it had been such a successful program, and they were the front runner, and they went out and hired Greg Goldner, who was a campaign manager for Rahm Emanuel and for Mayor Daley in the past, and they had a whole team of juiced up lobbyists, and their job was to promote this expansion into speed cameras, which was controversial at the time.
But Redflex wanted to do it, I assume.
Redflex was in. I mean, there was internal documents that says they were, until the story broke about the bribery, it was pretty much a done deal.
Now wait a minute. Okay, so now, when did the first stories start coming out about Redflex being a little bit questionable?
Well, as you know, we had an interview with Rahm Emanuel. When he first took office, he was pushing the speed camera expansion and some other less sexy programs, and he got elected on this promise that I'm going to be the most transparent mayor in Chicago's history. So we decided to hold him to that, and we asked him for his internal communications on speed cameras and these other issues. And he surprisingly granted me an interview to explain to me why he wasn't going to give us any of his internal communications. And so I sat down with him, and in that interview, he essentially was berating me because we had ignored some red light camera study that showed there were 60% fewer pedestrian deaths in Chicago at red light cameras. And I'd never heard of the study, and I said, well, show me the study. And he said, go, get me the study. And tossed it across the desk to me. It was a one-page thing with some statistics on it. And it turned out that we went back to the office, and it turned out that all those statistics were completely bogus. They just weren't true. The city eventually had to acknowledge that they weren't true. But as that story started to expand, it just sort of snowballed from there. It started with me being told things by the mayor that weren't true, and then we found out about Greg Goldner's relationship, both to Red Flex and to the mayor. And then we found out that John Bills had retired from the city and gone to work for a Red Flex thing with Greg Goldner. And as soon as John Bills' name was in the paper, that's when we started hearing about
you need to look into this more.
There's a corruption here.
So, were there ever any indications of this level of corruption while Daley was mayor, or did it all start later?
Well, Red Flex knew. There had been an internal memo written that nobody in the city of Chicago had ever heard of back in 2010. That's what we got our hands on. Alderman Burke made allegations early. Alderman Burke, who was one of the guys who was aligned with another company, was the other companies were suspecting, because the RFPs were the requests, the documents, the things that were advertising for bidders were all written in such a way that pretty much excluded everybody else.
Right. Now wait, hold on. I'm just pausing you here. So Red Flex has had this contract, and it's been going very well, certainly for them, and certainly for the mayor, because he's raking in hundreds of millions of dollars in fines. But what was the RFP that a lot has been made of the fact that John Bills manipulated the request for proposals? Was that for the speed cameras, or?
No. In 2006 and 2007, the red light camera program blossomed from just a few cameras to this enormous thing, and they did that based on an expansion of the program. And that expansion, John Bills tried to get them a sole source contract. Ed Burke blocked that.
Okay, all right.
And then they went out for bids, and John Bills, according to testimony at the federal trial, John Bills allowed Red Flex to write the specs for the RFP, and they essentially excluded a lot of other. I mean, if you can write your own specs, then so. And Ed Burke and this other company were writing emails internally and accusing and saying this is sketchy and something's going on here, but it never went anywhere. And Ed Burke quieted down, and the Red Flex eventually ended up getting it anyway. So there were some indications in 2007 and 2008 that their allegations were made, but they were never investigated.
We now know from the trial that at this point John Bills was actually having private meetings with Red Flex, right?
On a regular
helping
basis.
them understand how the process worked and how to write the specs.
Oh yes.
So that they could be the winner.
He had a handler. He had Red Flex had hired a consultant friend of his in Chicago who was acting as the bag man. He was meeting with the CEO of the company and the top salesman of the company on a regular basis. They bought him a condominium in Arizona near their headquarters. Not only were they giving him cash bribes, they were sending him on vacations and paying for hotel rooms and golf outings, and they bought him a car, they bought him a boat, they bought him a condominium in Arizona. All this time he is talking to them about how he was going to expand this and how we were going to have speed cameras, we're going to have more red light cameras, we're going to have school bus cameras, we're going to have, the list went on and on and on.
You really have to wonder at some point what gets into a guy's mind when you get that deep in, that you just begin to believe, I guess, that you can pull this off. I mean, it doesn't occur to you that you are out there really skating on some pretty thin ice.
Well, his argument has been he never had the ability to pull it off.
Oh, yeah,
He's
that's
just
right.
a mid-level bureaucrat that people like him don't make these kind of decisions on $130 million contracts.
Right.
So.
Yeah, and that, of course, that's still hanging in the air, isn't it? I mean, the jury didn't buy it, though.
Well, the jury did buy it. His argument was, I'm not guilty. These lobbyists, these well-juiced lobbyists were paying all the bribes to politicians. The jury, and we've talked to one of the jurors at length about this, the jury thought, well, maybe this went higher, but John Bills is guilty. The issue is the federal prosecutors at trial all the evidence that Bills met with Daley, Bills met with Madigan, Bills told them what lobbyists to hire, what well-connected lobbyists to hire. Not one of those not one of the lobbyists, not one of the politicians ever testified at the federal trial.
Yeah.
It does raise questions about, was Bills the end-all, be-all of this scheme? And we don't have the answers to that.
Where do Bills and Emanuel fit into this thing? Did they ever interact in any way?
Yeah, Bills was on his way out when Emanuel took office. The connection is Greg Goldner. Bills went to work after he left the city of Chicago, retired in June 2011.
Which would be a month after Emanuel takes office.
But he went to work for someone who's very, very close to Rahm Emanuel and Redflex. Redflex hired Greg Goldner, Goldner is very well connected to both administrations, and they were already on their way. They had been working on speed for years already. The foundation had been laid, and Bills went and took a job with the company that he had helped.
So he was in that job for at least, the first couple of years of the Emanuel administration, Bills was?
No, he was in that job until we started writing about it, and then they cut him loose.
Oh, they did, okay.
Yes.
All right. So he wasn't there very long then?
Right. No.
Okay, all right. So then Emanuel comes into office, and we presume, looked at this and saw this as a giant cash cow, the way his predecessor had, thought he could expand it. And suddenly he runs into frankly, he runs into the Tribune.
Right.
This is what happens.
Right. If our story had come out 3 months later, 4 months later, 5 months later, Redflex would have had the speed camera contract as well.
Yeah.
And that's the subject of a lawsuit that we currently have against the mayor for his internal correspondence.
Right.
What was he saying? What decisions were being made?
Right.
Who was he taking advice from? Was he talking to any of these lobbyists? What was going on at City Hall that was preceding this?
Well, one presumes that the mayor read your stories and said, this is terrible, we have to get to the bottom of this, and then he pulled the plug on Redflex.
He pulled the plug on Redflex after it became clear that Redflex was corrupt. And yet, for more than a year, they continued in the contract because he didn't want to shut down the program.
Right.
So,
So he let them run it while they bid it out.
Right. He likes to take credit for firing them, but he fired them under an intense amount of pressure. He had really no choice.
Now, of course, then we get into a whole different level of things. Of another company comes in. This is Xerox, right? Xerox comes in to take over, and they immediately find out that their software is not compatible with Redflex's software. I know you've written all about this, and it takes millions of dollars, which the city had to pay, as I understand it, to basically scrap the old cameras and put new ones in and reprogram them.
The problem began back during the bribery scheme when typically what happens is a municipality, a public body will lease this equipment for a monthly fee. The city of Chicago was buying all these cameras.
Yeah.
So when they fired Redflex, they're stuck with all this Redflex equipment. Normally, what Redflex would take the cameras and they'd hire a new company, and the company would bring in their own.
Right.
Well, they had to figure out how to make this transition to all this. It was essentially junk. They had to figure out how do we make this junk work.
And it also kind of masks another aspect of this, that Redflex even got a good deal on that. They didn't even have to. They didn't even have to own the hardware. They sold the hardware to the city, fully understanding, I'm sure, that at some point this stuff is going to become obsolete and it's not going to be their problem.
Well, that came out at trial. One of the reasons they wanted to do that was because it would be impossible for another company. It was essentially sealing them into the contract.
Right. At taxpayers' expense.
Well, yes. They were paying $100,000 per camera.
Is that what it was? $100,000 per camera?
That's how it started.
And how much did Bills get per camera again? Let's remind folks. How much did he get personally?
He started at $1,500 per camera, and it moved to $2,000.
So every time he had a meeting at Manny's or wherever and said, I think we should put a camera at 47th and Ashland, the bag man would open up the bag. I mean, it's mind-boggling. It's totally mind-boggling. So we were running a little bit short on time here, but as far so just to get with the timeline again, go back to the timeline. Mayor Emanuel says no, we're gonna bite the bullet on this. We're gonna bring in a whole new company, and we're gonna do this above board and in the transparent way that I promised as mayor.
Right.
And then you
Nothing
get in
about
the way like always, and
nothing about City Hall is transparent. We have tried and tried and tried, and finally.
David, that can't be right. I've read the press releases. It's the most transparent administration in Chicago history. I know it is. They've said so.
Right. Well, it's not transparent when it comes to what the mayor's doing on our behalf. Any of his internal communications, his emails, his text messages, every time you see B-roll of him, he's communicating with his thumbs. There are places in this world where those things are a matter of public record, and they are simply not here. And that's currently under litigation right now. We're going to figure out.
So what is it exactly that you want from Rahm Emanuel? You want to know who he's calling and who he's texting.
I want to know how, when he comes to a decision that speed cameras are a good idea, what's the real story behind that? Who is he talking to? What are they saying?
What experts is he consulting?
Yeah, is he talking to the lobbyists? Redflex hires Greg Goldner, for instance. Do Greg Goldner and Rahm Emanuel talk about how many speed cameras there should be? He won't say, and he won't. Those communications are none of our business, according to City Hall.
But you've conceded, I assume this is just a legal issue, you have no right to know what he is saying to them. You just need to know that he's meeting with them. Is that correct?
Put something in writing. That is a public record. It has to be preserved. It has to be. Now, there are things that are exempt from public scrutiny, things that you can talk about on certain things that you can't, that he can withhold from us for some small period of time, but there is no evidence that he's even preserving these communications. Now, when he picks up a telephone and speaks to someone, there's no, he doesn't have to record those conversations, but certainly the phone registers, I mean, who he's talking to, and when he puts it in writing, it's just like an internal office memorandum, right? When he writes one of his top lieutenants a memo, that's a public record. That belongs to us, not to Mayor Emanuel.
But the part that I've never really understood is, I try to imagine if I were mayor or any public official, there are conversations that you're having where you're formulating your ideas. These are not really public conversations. I mean, if I'm talking to the leadership of the city council or something, and I'm saying, how do you think we should strategize this? Who's going to vote this way? Who's not going to vote? What do I need to do? I don't see that as being a public document.
He is perfectly capable, public officials are perfectly capable of picking up a phone or going to meet people in person, get up, go down the hall, and talk to them. Those things are never public. There are places in this country where those conversations are indeed public. You can't meet with somebody on a topic of public interest without advertising it, and so that way votes are not conducted. City Hall, when you go to City Council and you watch a vote, a lot of that is theater. It's pro forma. It's the decisions have already been made. There are places in this country where that's a felony. I've been there. Yes, Florida, the state of Florida.
Really?
You can't do it. There's a sunshine law. One elected official cannot meet with another elected official to discuss a matter of public concern that might come for a vote for them without advertising it and having a public meeting. You can't do it.
Well, what about a department head and a deputy?
That's different.
That's different because they're not elected?
As soon as they write an email that goes from one place to another, that's a public record. Now, it might not be public now, but at some point after the decision has been made, we can go back in some places in this country and see, because all of these documents, all of these conversations, I mean, the taxpayers are the ones who are paying for the paper, we're paying for the computers, we're paying for the chairs, we're paying for the walls.
Right.
Why shouldn't we be part of the conversation?
Well, I always heard in City Hall, I heard it many times, and I know the same thing is said in business. Email is for good news and telephones are for bad news. You don't create a document if it's something that you don't want to read on the front page of the newspaper the next morning. So don't create documents.
Well, in the city of Chicago, it doesn't matter whether you create documents because we can't see them anyway.
Can't see them anyway. But I really want to make that point. I wanted to spend an extra minute or two examining that point because I think in all cases there is the deliberative process where people are saying and thinking things that they will not think 2 days later because they've changed their mind, because they're having a real exchange of views. And it's best, it actually appears to me even as a journalist, that process is probably best protected from public view, because if everything you have to do is completely in the public view, then you are going to pull your punches on a lot of things. You're not going to be as honest as you might be in a closed room to say, listen, don't do this. This guy is bad. Don't do this.
That's certainly City Hall's argument. That's why all of those records about anything that comes before a decision are exempt from public scrutiny in the state of Illinois. What I'm here to tell you is it's done differently in other places.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not telling you that Florida or Washington State or Massachusetts or any of those places are angelic. What I am here to tell you is there are places that understand that a public government can't be run like a corporation. I don't know about you, but my boss, if they want to, can stand over my shoulder at my desk and watch what I do, because I don't own my computer.
Right.
I don't own my time. I'm not there. This stuff doesn't belong to me. We are the boss here, not Rahm Emanuel. Rahm Emanuel is just their immediate supervisor for the time being. So why is it that we can't participate in the stuff that we are paying for? If we can't see it right now while the decision is being made, I don't understand why that deliberative process shouldn't at some point be public. If somebody wants to say something that's so embarrassing, maybe they shouldn't be saying it, right? I mean, I'm trying to understand. I'm not trying to understand that argument. I see it in some cases. I mean, if you're dealing with a corporation that has some proprietary information, or I mean, there are certainly things that can be exempted from the public scrutiny. But from one bureaucrat talking to another bureaucrat, and for some reason they've got some stupid idea, why shouldn't I? I'm their boss. Why shouldn't I be able to see that?
One of the things that I really wanted to talk to you about today is that this morning before we did the show, I went back to, what was it, February 8th, 2012, this infamous hour and 15-minute interview that you had with Rahm Emanuel. At this point, he's, I don't know, 6-7 months in office, I think, or something. Well, no, February. It was almost, it was getting close to being a year. And you had been granted the honor of having an hour-long meeting with him. And you printed in the paper the transcript of it, which is still online, and we're going to put it online at our place at chicagonewsroom.org too, so you can read it. It's like a 45-minute fun read. Why I recommend it today is because that Mayor Emanuel is a very different Mayor Emanuel than the one we see today, or at least it feels that way to me. He is as cocky as can be. He is insulting. He's just aggressive as he can possibly be. And this is before the blue sweater Mayor Emanuel and the Mayor Emanuel that at least we see in public today, who seems to be so much more contrite and more willing to compromise on things. What is your response? Have you read that interview recently at all? Have you refreshed your memory of that interview?
Portions of it, yes. Yeah.
How do you feel about it today when you think back on it?
I mean, when we did that, we had absolutely no intention of publishing that interview. We didn't. I had a little tape recorder there, and
it reads that way. You can see that. Yeah.
And I was there to get. I really thought I was going to get answers that never came. But when my supervisors at the Tribune saw that thing and they said, this is important, that people understand who this guy is. I don't know that he has changed, and I think you hit the key thing, what the image that he presents changed. I mean, that was the whole tenor of the interview. I wanted to know about why he wasn't transparent, and his argument was, well, I'm going to tell you. And I was saying, I don't want to hear you say it. I don't want to know. I don't really. That was the whole tenor of the interview. And I don't know that he got it then, and I don't know that he still gets it, or if he does, he doesn't want to admit it. I don't care how he says he governs. I want to know how he governs.
Well, and you say that many times.
Yes.
It's like, I'm not here to ask you how you govern. I'm here to get the documents to see how you govern.
There's always a difference. I've been doing this 32 years, and there's always a difference between what they say and what's really happening.
Normal human beings in that situation would have withered away and would have just kind of, I mean, I know I would have. Let me just put me there. If that had been me, I think I would have, about 15 minutes in, I would have just said, well, I'm not getting anywhere with this, and I would have just let it end. But you stood up to him in a way that is almost cringeworthy to read. You just kept pushing him and making him madder and madder.
Right. Well, I mean, I legitimately wanted the answers. I really, and I think a lot of it comes from the fact that I spent many 15 years as a reporter in Florida, and when I came here, I was literally shocked.
Oh, that's interesting.
At the culture. At the, I mean.
Welcome to Chicago.
Yeah. Well, it's just striking to me that the people of the city of Chicago cannot know what goes behind every decision that is made at City Hall that affects every aspect of their lives. It's just none of their business.
Well, I think that goes back to our founding documents, because we were just treated recently to the thing about the first meeting of the city council and the votes. There were more votes than there were aldermen or something, and it's none of your business to know why that is. And it's been that way ever since. So
there is no debate. I mean, when you make all of those records, the deliberative process, when you make all of those records public, what that does, most of the time, nobody's going to go after those records. What that does is it puts everybody at City Hall on notice. Look, when you say something, don't say something stupid or embarrassing, or don't be corrupt. But it also forces decisions and debate out into the open. You go to. I've been to city council meetings, and it's theater. There are no. It's all, whatever debate there is all, it just seems like a stage performance. All the decisions have been made, almost all of them. And
that's what the omnibus is for. At the end of the city council meeting, everything gets thrown in an omnibus, everybody votes aye, and it's over.
And so why shouldn't we be privy to all of that deliberative process? Why shouldn't the people paying for it be privy to the deliberative process?
You idealists. Sometimes you're just.
I'm waiting for somebody to make an argument that I understand, because I'm perfectly happy. But that's why I have been so adamant about it, because I come from a place where, as a reporter, I'm not saying there wasn't. I'm not saying there wasn't corruption in Florida. But
But you have a legal right to. So, do you have any idea how many red light stories you've written? I mean, I tried to go through them this morning, but it's hard to see. There's a large collection of them, but it's dozens and dozens.
Yes, it's been, and most of the stories that I've written, I mean, we once we uncovered the corruption, the stories centered on, well, okay, if the contract is corrupt, what about the program? We have been able to uncover, and almost every time you turn around, there are literally tens of thousands of tickets that should have never been issued in both the red light camera program and the speed camera program, and it essentially illustrates how the people of the city of Chicago have been plugged into a cash machine, and City Hall has walked away in a lot of instances. Parks that aren't parks, school zones that are being enforced at the wrong speed at the wrong time of day.
Yellow light timing.
Oh, the
yellow light timing is a half-hour show right there.
Well, yeah, and the city of Chicago has the shortest yellow lights in the country, allowable. Almost every other city in the country has come around to the 21st century science that suggests at a higher speed, you should have a higher yellow light. And so when you combine the 3-second Chicago yellow light with the fact that there's a red light camera up there, it just doesn't give people enough time to make a cognitive decision. And so there's a 22% increase in rear end crashes that people are causing.
And that's one that Rahm Emanuel can't say was done by John Bills and Rich Daley, because he authorized when the companies switched over from Redflex to Xerox, he permitted Xerox to drop the camera trigger level to 2.9 seconds, right?
Well, when a yellow light was on its own dropping below 3 seconds by hundredths of a second or tenths of a second, typically they weren't issuing tickets because it dropped below standards. They relaxed that standard. I think somewhere in the neighborhood of $7 million in tickets or something like that.
Which they eventually more or less rebated.
Well, they acknowledged it was wrong, but they offered some rebates, but not all of them.
Not all, right. But nevertheless, you discovered that there was a document saying, we'll go with 2.9.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's incredible. David, there's one other thing. I think of you as being the camera correspondent, and this is completely off the topic, but you don't always write about that. You've written a little bit about the Laquan McDonald case, and this is another issue that's just of intense interest to me, is how you could have dash cam video systems in, well, we don't know how many squad cars, but most of them apparently, and to have randomly 8 of them show up at a scene and have no audio working on any of them.
And most of them had no video.
Most of them no video. And I went back and read one of the stories that you wrote, and it is really chilling to read what McCarthy said, because this was when our police chief was Gary McCarthy. And he said at the press conference that day, the day of the release of the first video, he was asked whether police cameras were supposed to have sound, and his quote that you quoted him as saying, "There's supposed to be audio, and it's supposed to happen at a couple of different instances. This is one of the things that we're working on. Sometimes we have technical difficulties," McCarthy said. "Sometimes officers need to be disciplined if they don't turn it on at the right circumstance, which is why we're working out all the details." And then asked again if audio existed with footage of the shooting, McCarthy answered, No, there was no audio to my knowledge with any of the video that was taken. No, it didn't exist." We all remember that quote at the time. But when you go back now and read that quote, knowing that he was pushed out and that he clearly knew that there was some much bigger problem here and was trying to just kind of like tamp it down.
Yeah, and you know what? People, sometimes on the red light camera stuff, we write these stories that expose these things, and people assume that for some reason I or the newspaper is against these cameras and this technology. And it's technology. The technology isn't the issue, it's how it's run. It's always how it's run. And you talk to experts on dash cams, and you talk to experts on speed cameras or red light cameras, it's always the same. You have to run these things in a fair and honest way, and when you don't, you lose confidence in them. Maybe the police officers don't like to be monitored 24/7 when they're in the car, and so they turn the cameras off. Why is the Chicago Police Department not enforcing that? Why weren't they enforcing it that day? Those are very legitimate questions.
And what really, I guess, maybe I'm getting out a little bit ahead of this here, but it really begins to become apparent that the people at the top knew this was going on, that this was a problem. They were aware of the fact that these cameras were not being used properly. And there doesn't appear to be any evidence that they were really aggressively trying to fix that.
Yeah, I don't think, I agree. There isn't any evidence that they were aggressively
We don't like
to
use
fix it.
the word "I think" on this program, but it's hard not to conclude that I mean, especially when you see the stories that have come out later on that, you know, there were, I forget the numbers now, but just massive numbers of these things that would be fixed and the next day they're broken again. At some point, you're in charge of this. You have to say, wow, this camera program is not working. Nobody's uploading any video.
Again, Ken, I will go back to the deliberative process. There's still no evidence to suggest they're fixing it other than what they say when they get behind a microphone. We want the records.
All right.
What
So
are you really doing?
In this case, it's a double thing. You want the record of how the decision was made and how the discipline has been handled, but you also want the record itself. Because, as you said, and to echo what you were saying half an hour ago, transactions between the police and the public, there could be nothing more public than that. There could be nothing that would be more in the public interest to know about than how those interactions go down.
Except in the city of Chicago, where it's really none of our business. That's just the way it is.
I think I'd argue that we've seen that happening in a lot of places around the country because there is a kind of a, you know, I said the other day that I think, maybe I hope that this is a kind of a generational thing, that younger police officers coming in who have GoPro cameras and use cameras for everything would maybe see this as a little bit differently than a 60-year-old cop or a 50-year-old cop would, and maybe it'll correct itself as time goes by. But you need the assurance that when something really nasty happens on that camera, that the right people are able to see it.
Right.
Wow.
How about the people who paid for it? They should be able to see it.
Yeah. Yeah, that. Oh, you mean like the taxpayers?
Yeah.
David, thank you so much. It was a great conversation, and I think I can say without fear of contradiction that I think you're doing a great job.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And it's been a real public service. So thank you for all your work, and thanks to the Tribune for what you've done.
Thank you.
Okay. That's it for today. We'll be back next week with another program. As we mentioned earlier, we're hoping that maybe Karen Lewis will be our guest next week. It's tentative, but if not, maybe the week after that. And we'll get some people on to talk from the Board of Education side too, because we got a lot to talk about. Thank you for watching. This is Chicago Newsroom. You can watch us anytime you want by going to this here address and have a binge weekend watching old Chicago newsrooms, because they're all there, like 300 of them. We'll see you next week with another show. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.